Hello again and welcome back to 10 Things About Writing. Today I'm going to talk about an element of writing which never actually goes away. Much of writing is actually rewriting and editing, and one of the things you have to do once you get a full first draft is you have to look at it again and knock it into shape. Now, editing is one of those things that you either love or hate. If you hate it, I hope that this session will help to teach you how to love it, because actually you're going to do a hell of a lot of it. Most authors end up doing multiple edits, sometimes as many as a couple of dozen edits, before they have a completed draft, a publishable draft. And if you're thinking about publishing your work, it's always worth giving editing the time that it requires. You owe it to yourself, you owe it to your work, you owe it to your readers. Now, some people try to edit as they go along. I have to say I'm slightly guilty of this myself, but it's not always a great idea. I've now managed to refine my as-you-go editing to just maybe a quarter of an hour before I start properly working to get me into the zone. So what I do is I read my last chapter aloud, baby polish it as I go along, and then boom, straight into the next chapter. If you don't start writing pretty much straight away at the beginning of your day, you may find yourself falling into a sort of editorial time hole, which will ultimately not be as useful as actually saving the whole of your editing until you've got a final first draft. Most first drafts are not great. This is normal. So if you feel that what you're doing isn't brilliant and needs work, this is fine. Take a few notes as you go along. Remind yourself of the things you wanted to solidify, but get a first draft first, and then you can start the editorial process, and it will be a useful process that you will benefit from and your work will benefit from it. So the way I do it, and it may not necessarily be the way you do it, but I think that there are a number of things that you need to take into account when you're editing work, and these things are not exactly rules, but they're the things that work for most people. One is give yourself plenty of time before you decide to edit a piece of work. Sometimes this isn't possible, sometimes you're on a deadline, but try to factor in a certain amount of time to give yourself objectivity so that you can actually look at your work with new eyes, because this is actually the trick of any editorial work. It is about looking at your work with a new set of eyes, and at some point that will lead to your needing an actual editor. But for the moment, we're talking about self-editing here, and you can do a lot of work on a manuscript before you need to give it to somebody else. So I like to give 3 months to a first draft, sometimes even longer. This is a bit of a luxury. Sometimes I have to fight for it, but it is worthwhile for me because it means that when I do get to editing, I have the kind of objectivity that you need to actually be brutal with your work sometimes, to cut what needs to be cut, to actually admit to yourself, okay, this bit isn't working, it needs fixing. Because otherwise, what you tend to feel, and this is completely natural, you tend to feel protective of your work. You tend to feel as if, it's great and nobody should see anything wrong with it at all. And of course it's wonderful. Yeah, you've got to get past that bit. We all go to that bit of thinking, but we have to get past it because actually all first drafts are precarious and usually need a fair bit of work. If you can't give yourself 3 months, try to give yourself at least 3 weeks. That way you can step back from your work. You can even start work on something else. That helps enormously in terms of achieving objectivity. But it means that you can return to your manuscript and you can read it not like a writer, a slightly defensive, hopeful writer, but like a reader. It's really essential to learn to read your own work as a reader would, because obviously, in most of your cases, readers are what you're writing this for. So approach your work as a reader would. And there are a number of ways of getting into the habit of reading your work objectively. And one, I think, is reading aloud. I'm a great fan of reading aloud. It's the most powerful editorial tool you have. And it certainly fixes a lot of things. It can fix your dialogue if your dialogue's a bit clunky, or if there are too many adverbs or too many dialogue tags, or it's been slowed down too much. Reading it aloud will fix that straight away. The same goes for anything else. Writing has its own rhythms, its own algorithms, its own music. Remember that all writing is ultimately designed to be read aloud at some point. Some of you may go on to have audiobooks made. Your audiobook reader will certainly thank you if you read aloud during the editorial process. It will make the whole thing more fluid, easier to read, and it will also chop out various things in your narrative that sound either clunky or unwieldy or haven't been properly finished. It will also usually bring to mind any verbal tics you've got. Every writer has got them. Things that you say far too much. Some people have their characters playing with their hair a lot. Some have them nodding a lot. Some have them laughing nervously a lot. These things, when you read them aloud, you will be much more aware of when they happen, and you will be aware that you have to chop some of those out. So read aloud, always. You may feel a bit strange doing this at first. That's fine. You'll get used to it. Everybody feels strange at first. Read to the wall, read to your cat. Some people benefit from actually recording their reading if they have particularly audio-based mind and they're able to focus better if they're listening to themselves. Find what works for you. But I find that reading aloud generally works for almost everybody, and most manuscripts are better for an editorial process that involves reading. It also takes time, and it means that you can't just skip lines or skip paragraphs or skip words when you're reading aloud. You force yourself to experience that writing as a reader would. And if you do find yourself wanting to skip something, maybe it shouldn't be there. Maybe it's something that you need to cut. Another thing that I do is, and this is the simplest trick in the book, you want to look at something with new eyes? Change the font. Change it to something that you've not used before, and you'll find that as the text readjusts, you will be able to see it in a way that you didn't see it before. Because once we've read a text over and over and over again, we all of us find that there's a sort of word blindness that kicks in, and we find that we just don't notice things anymore. Spelling mistakes, repeated words, those things seem to just zone out, whereas as soon as you change the font, boom, it's back there, it's in your face, it's new. You have a new way of perceiving that text, and you will see the things that need fixing. Now, there are two kinds of editorial processes, if you like. There is the big structural edit, and then there's the line-by-line edit. Reading aloud often fixes any line-by-line problems. When it comes to the structural edit, the overview, you need to be a bit more fluid in your approach. The thing to do, and if you've given yourself time to be objective about this, it becomes easier and easier. You need to approach your story as a reader would. The more time you've given yourself, the easier that will be. And so the first thing to do when you're contemplating a big first structural edit, read the whole thing through. Have a look at it. Have a look how a reader would experience your story, and then ask yourself a few questions. First, questions about the plot. Is the plot the right shape? Does it feel as if it's the right shape? Do you find that there is enough explanation at the beginning without being over expositional and info dumpy? Do you get a sense of that world? Are you happy to return to that world, the world you've created in your story? Do you feel that you understand it? Will your reader understand it? Is there enough detail about it seeded throughout the book? Does your plot have the same algorithmic shape that it should have? Do you have some explanation at the beginning? Do you have something that starts your story off recognisably? Do you have escalating tension throughout the story's journey? Do you have a satisfying confrontation or explanation or whammy at the end? Do you have a conclusion that is not rushed, but which gives the reader the feeling that things have been tied up to a reasonably satisfactory way? Is your plot the right shape? If it's not, Go back to graphing out your plot on a piece of paper. Work out where the beats are. Work out where the moments of tension are, the moments of relaxing of the tension. You'll be able to tell, hopefully at this point, whether something is too rushed at a certain point and needs pulling back, or whether actually something is too slow and needs speeding up. You will be able at this point to manage the tension better because you'll have something to work from. Think then about your characters. How do you feel about them? Do you still believe in them? Do you know enough about them? Will your reader know enough about them? Do they have a satisfying journey? Is their arc, their development as a fully rounded character, is that satisfactory? And then look at the scenes that you have written. And in each case, make an argument for yourself whether that scene is fulfilling its purpose. Every scene should have a purpose. Ideally, every scene should have a little arc, should have a little mounting step along the way of your story. Every scene should deliver something, either plot or atmosphere, or something to do with your world, or some interaction between characters that tells you something about them, or maybe a combination of all of those things. But either way, if a scene is just there and you feel that it doesn't actually contribute very much at all, then possibly think about whether it needs to be there at all. Now at this point, some of you will find that you either overwrite or you underwrite. I tend to overwrite. I always have done. I started off writing immensely long books, and my books have got shorter and shorter until they've got to a manageable length. But I found initially that what I had to do, my overwhelming editing process, involved cutting. And this can be actually quite heartbreaking for a writer. You know, you've spent hours writing a scene and it's packed with the most amazing description, and actually it doesn't serve a purpose, and your best decision is actually to cut the whole thing. Being brutal in this way is a skill that you have to learn if you write the way I do. And I had to learn it, and it took me a while. And now I've worked out that sometimes you have to think of the extraneous text that you write as kind of scaffolding. It is scaffolding that enables you to build your story. At the end of your story, when your story is built, you don't keep the scaffolding, you knock it off. But it doesn't mean that it was of no use. It has served its purpose. And this way, I get over that feeling of stress that, I spent 9 hours writing this scene and it's all gone. It hasn't all gone. It's served its purpose. It has helped build something else. One of the things you need to get out of your head as a writer is that anything you write can be wasted. It can't. Even if you cut it all out of your final edited version, it still served a purpose. And something that you find particularly good but you had to remove because it didn't quite fit into your plot, well, it can always be recycled. Words are wonderful recycling objects. Sometimes you can pop a scene into another story and it works beautifully, or an idea or an extra character or something you had to strip out. That doesn't have to disappear forever, but you do have to look at your finished product, your novel, as something which exists in its own right, which has its own direction, its own fluidity. You can't just argue to keep something in because it took you a long time to make, because nobody cares about that really in the long run. Your readers will only care about whether your book is the right shape, whether it makes the right kind of sense with them, whether it takes them on the journey they wanted to go. Now, some of you will be quite the opposite of me, and instead of stripping things out, extraneous descriptions, extra characters that can be amalgamated into one, you will be wanting to put things in. Try not to think of these extra things as padding out your word count. No one cares about your word count. The story has to have its own integrity. And so anything that you put into your story feeling that it's padding is almost by definition useless and doesn't want to be there. You want to put in things that need to be there. So have a look at what your story is lacking. Chances are your plot may already be in place, but there will be areas of thinness in terms of your characterization and your word building and your atmosphere. So have a look at those things. Have a look at your world. Is it properly established? What does it need? Does it need texture? Does it need sensual detailing? Does it need stuff about the weather? Does it need stuff about vegetation, culture, habit, language, the whole of the things that come together to build your impression of a place? Have you established that enough? If you haven't, it's a question of adding detailing. Same goes for your characters. Do you believe in your characters enough? Do you know enough about your characters? Will you be able to convey enough of what you know about your characters to your readers? If not, it's a question of detailing. And this tends to be fine detailing. Just adding small touches so that we feel that we are getting to know somebody during the experience of reading this book. Sometimes you'll find that chunks of plot are missing. Sometimes you'll see, oh yeah, okay, between here and here, we need a scene. The scene has to have a purpose, but sometimes the purpose is obvious. Sometimes it's, we need a come down scene here. We need a scene to explain why this person did that. We need a scene between these two people. Sometimes you can just do that. Rubik's Cube your scene in there between two spikes of tension and go, yeah, okay, I've now finished that little arc of the storyline. It now makes a lot more rhythmic sense. So have a look at what you feel that your book needs, and then go ahead and do it. Write your second draft. And then depending on what kind of writer you are, you may want to write a third draft or a fourth draft, until eventually you are satisfied enough to pass your draft on to somebody else. And here's where you're going to need an editor or a beta reader, because there's only so much that one writer can do. After a while, however good you are at self-editing, you will have to pass your work on to somebody else, your very first reader, to see if it passes the So What test. And we'll talk a little more about the So What test later, but for the moment, thank you for listening. If you were interested in pursuing this a little more, my book, 10 Things About Writing, is now available in all sorts of ebook formats. You can ask me questions on Twitter about this if anything has been brought up to your attention. Until then, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.